Good evening, happy Lag BaOmer, and welcome to Nitzutzais HaParsha, sparks of the Parsha, tidbits of Torah interpretations, short ones, so to whet your appetite for learning more. And we start with identifying today's holiday within the Parsha, within the weekly Torah portion, which is Emor. The Shalah, one of the 17th century great sages, he was known as a great halachic authority, legal authority, a great Kabbalist, a moralist, and a Jewish leader, who started off in Poland and he moved to Israel, says that whenever we read a portion of the Torah, and that very week there is a holiday, even though the Torah portions were not designed to follow the sequence of holidays, nevertheless, that Torah portion must have a connection to that holiday. What is that based on? So the Rebbe would always explain that it's based on the very basic principle of divine providence. That every detail, the way the Baal Shem Tov taught divine providence, that every detail that happens in the world is not by chance, not by coincidence. Everything that happens, if two events coincide, there is a reason and a purpose. That's true even in events that have nothing to do with Torah directly. How much more so when the events are related to Torah, that they're not just haphazard. Somehow this holiday coincides with this parsha. So this week we have the holiday of Lag BaOmer. In fact, today, and as we are doing this program, we are at the very end, the tail end of Lag BaOmer, which is a holiday. Some people would call it a minor holiday, but I don't like to use the term minor for this day in particular, because even though it's minor in the sense that there are no restrictions that we have in other holidays like Passover, it is simply not a minor holiday. It is a major holiday with major spiritual overtones to it. What happened in Lag BaOmer? Most people are familiar with the story of Rabbi Akiva, the greatest sage of his time, who had 24,000 students who perished in a plague during this period between Passover and Shavuos, known as Sfira, the days that we count. And they ceased dying on Lag BaOmer. So Lag BaOmer is a day that we celebrate their passing had come to an end. Why did they pass away? The Talmud explains because they did not treat each other with adequate respect. So this day, when there's a respite from that tragedy, focuses on the need to treat one another with respect and love. That's a subject that requires much more attention, but we'll leave it at that. The second, which is seen as the primary reason for the celebration of Lag BaOmer, is that this is the day Rabbi Akiva's student, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who became a student after he lost the 24,000, passed away on this day and declared it a day of wedding, a wedding day when his soul is reunited with his Maker. He revealed some of the deepest, heretofore hidden secrets of the Torah, the Kabbalah, the Jewish mysticism contained in the work called the Zohar, and asked that this day should be a day of celebration. And indeed, the largest congregation of Jews anywhere in the world occurs at his gravesite in Meron, northern Israel. Hundreds of thousands of Jews congregate there to celebrate this day by lighting bonfires symbolizing the light that he generated, that he created. And the name of his magnum opus, the name of his major work, although he's quoted extensively in the Mishnah and in the Talmud, perhaps more than any other sage of that period, but his main contribution was the authorship of the Zohar, which means radiance, light, luminescence. Where is that hinted in this week's Torah portion? Is hinted in the very first verse, where God says to Moses, "Speak to the Kohanim, to the priests, the sons of Aaron, and say to them." And that is obviously redundant. If it says speak to them, it doesn't have to say afterwards and say to them. It reminds us of the joke of this rabbi. He would get up and he would say, "Before I speak, I'd like to say a few words." Well, the Torah is not a joke. Every word is very much measured Torah is very frugal in the choice of words, not to add a word, it's unnecessary. Why is the word speak to them repeated? And Rashi says, and this is quoting from earlier sources, the Talmud, lehazhir gedolim avaktanim, to admonish, to warn the adults over the minors, that the adults should admonish the minors concerning this particular law, which is about how a Kohen has to respect his special status and he cannot come in contact with the dead, and so on and so forth. So the Torah says, speak to the elders, that they in turn should speak to the younger generation. And the word to admonish them, lehazhir, has another meaning. In Hebrew, words can have several meanings, and very often, if not always, they are always interconnected. The word lehazhir also means to bring light, same root as the word Zohar. That you're supposed to get the older generation not just to tell the younger generation. This is a very important lesson in chinuch, in Jewish education. Teachers are not there just to tell the students, do this, don't do this, this is right, this is wrong, but they have to instill the students with a feeling of light. They have to illuminate their lives. And that is the connection and the hint to Lag BaOmer in those very words of Lahazhir that is hinted in the repetition of the word Emor. Another point here, Emor in Hebrew means to speak or say. So does Daber mean speak or say. But there's a difference. Daber, we're told, means to speak firmly, harshly. Emor means to speak softly, speak with love. There's an expression in the Torah where God says to the Jewish people that you have made me hamarta, hamarti. I've made you special, you have made me special. But that root over there has a sense of something that is unique, something that is special, something that has warmth and light in it. So the word used in the Torah, Emor and Amarta, itself implies that the way that we're supposed to train the younger generation is through light, through warmth and love. So that's where Lag BaOmer is hinted. Actually, one way of beginning this program could have been by wishing everyone a good Shabbos, a kosher and happy Passover, a good Yom Tov Shavuos, a good and sweet year, Rosh Hashanah, and an easy fasting Yom Kippur, and a delightful and joyous Sukkot, and so on. And we could have added in Hanukkah and Purim. And the reason why we could have said that, and it wouldn't have been a sign that something was very wrong with my sense of time, but it's based on a passage in the Talmud that when a Jew studies the Torah concerning a particular mitzvah, even if it's not the time to do that mitzvah, by just learning what the Torah says about that mitzvah, it is as if you did that mitzvah. This parsha is unique in that it describes all the Jewish holidays, all the biblical holidays, and as we'll see, that the rabbinical holidays are also hinted here. I just mentioned Lag BaOmer, which is not a biblical holiday, of course, is hinted here, and likewise Hanukkah and Purim. But this is a parsha that has all of the holidays contained within it, and when you read this parsha, and you study it especially, it's as if you are actually observing Pesach and Shavuos and Sukkot, Rosh Hashanah and Kippur and Hanukkah and Purim and Lag BaOmer and Pesach Sheni, which we just observed a few days ago. So this is a very joyous week, in spite of the fact that most people just go through this parsha and they don't really connect to it as if it was talking about something timely. It's talking about holidays that occur the rest of the year. But in truth, these holidays are observed this week in their entirety, and this shows how this week is a very, very powerful and joyous week, and it always occurs around the time of Lag BaOmer. So that tells you something, that Lag BaOmer is not just one holiday, a minor holiday, a rabbinical holiday that came later, but it is the core that brings us joy to all of the holidays, because it is the holiday in which Rav Shimon Bar Yochai revealed the inner soul of Torah. And when you have the soul of Torah, you have simcha, you have joy. What was the commandment that they were told, the Kohanim, the priests were told to admonish the young? It's about the holiness associated with a Kohen, with a priest. priest, the Kohen, and the temple had certain restrictions. Restriction number one was he wasn't allowed to become tameh, to become ritually defiled by going to the funerals and coming in contact with the dead, with the exception of his close relatives that are enumerated here. They were not allowed to do other things that would degrade their bodies, certain types of cutting into their flesh, and so on and so forth. They're not allowed to marry a divorcee. They have certain restrictions that apply only to a Kohen. And then the Torah goes on to talk about how a Kohen who is a Baal Mum, who has a blemish, a physical defect, is disqualified from being a Kohen, from actually not being a Kohen, but serving in the temple, which sounds very discriminatory against someone who has a disability. It's not their fault. What do they do wrong? But as I explained in another class, I believe it might have been even last year at this time, that the Beis HaMikdash was a model of perfection. It's a model of the way things ought to be. We are so accustomed to seeing discrepancies, where good people suffer, bad people prosper, where the ideals are hardly manifested in reality. There's a difference between theory and practice. There's always a dichotomy. That's because we're living in an imperfect world, a misaligned world. The upper and the lower are not working together. That's why you can find people who are the nicest people in the world whose outer appearance is far from nice. So their external and the internal do not reflect one another. And conversely, there are people who look very handsome and beautiful on the outside, and inside they're corrupt and rotten and very ugly. The Beis HaMikdash was the model of the way things ought to be and the way things will ultimately be in the Messianic age, where the outer appearance of a person will be as perfect, as unblemished as the inside, as a way of illustrating this, and underscoring this unity, this synthesis, and consistency between the outer and the inner. The Kohen, the model of the ideal person, had to also externally look in a way that reflected his internal spirituality and holiness. Now, after the Torah goes through the laws concerning the Kohen and the sacrifices, they too have to be unblemished, the Torah gives us a general commandment. This is in chapter 22, verse 32, where it says, "One should not desecrate my holy name," God says. "Rather, I should be sanctified among the children of Israel." This commandment of being sanctified has several layers of meaning. Number one, it refers to certain prayers that we say in which we invoke God's holiness. We speak of God as being holy. For example, the Kaddish. The word Kaddish comes from the word holiness. The prayer of Kedusha, when we have a minyan and we have 10 men praying together, and we repeat the Amidah, the central prayer, there's an added prayer that is inserted called Kedusha, where we invoke God's holiness. And other prayers which can only be said, as the Torah here expresses itself, I should be sanctified among the children of Israel. And our sages tell us that this word among, by comparing it to other places where the same term applies, refers to the congregation. You can only sanctify God when you're doing it with a minyan. Many people are not aware of this, but if someone wants to say Kaddish for a loved one, that's a beautiful thing, and it does so much for the soul of the loved one, but it can only be said when there's a quorum, when there's a minyan. And because this prayer is one that has a lot of power to it, and you need the support, the spiritual support of the quorum in order to generate that power. And if it's done without the minyan, it's not helpful. This is a subject that requires a lot more attention, not for the sparks and tidbits of the parsha, but that's one level, that you're supposed to say certain prayers in which you invoke God's holiness, but you do that within the congregation. Another layer of meaning is that, and this is a much more extreme, that a Jew is required to suffer martyrdom, to give up his life in the case where a Jewish person's loyalty to his faith is being demanded of him. If a terrorist, God forbid, comes to a Jew with a weapon and says, I will kill you unless you convert to another religion, the Jew is required to die rather than to accede to that demand. Of course, if he can defend himself against the attacker, that is certainly appropriate and a mitzvah. Self-defense is not a right, it's not a privilege, it's an obligation. But in the sense where the case where there is no option other than either giving in to the demand or dying, one is supposed to die. That's called sanctifying God's name within the community of Israel. In between these two levels is another level of always doing things that other people who look at us will say, look how beautiful the Jewish people are who observe the teachings of the Torah. You are sanctifying God's name. Conversely, when a Jew does something improper, he is desecrating God's name, because people will say, look at the Jew who follows Judaism, look how he behaves so immorally, so unethically. So that's three levels of this commandment. Number one, to say the certain prayers that we sanctify God's name. Number two, to be prepared to die for our religion, for Judaism, for our belief in one God. And thirdly, to live in a way in which people look at us and see how special we are because we have a special relationship with God through a very special Torah. After this, the Torah then introduces, as I said before, all the holidays. It starts with Shabbos, and then it goes on to list all the biblical holidays. Now, Shabbos is generally separated from other holidays in many different ways. In terms of Jewish law, the laws of Shabbos are actually more strict than any other holiday, including Yom Kippur, although Yom Kippur is a close second. And Shabbos is generally not considered to be the same degree of joy that we exhibit on a major Jewish holiday. But nevertheless, Shabbos is also considered a holiday, and it's the source of all the holidays. Now here's an interesting area that was a bone of contention between the Jews, the rabbis, and the Sadducees. Now you have to realize that the Sadducees were a breakaway group who rejected the authority of the rabbis, rejected the oral Torah, which transmitted the true meaning of the words, the biblical text, which is, generally speaking, ambiguous and sometimes unintelligible without the oral tradition explaining it. And the Sadducees decided they don't want the rabbis to have any authority over them, and they rejected the oral tradition. Now here they came to a little bit of a problem. In the Torah it says that right after it talks about Pesach, it introduces the laws of Passover in chapter 23. The 15th of the month is the festival of Matzah, and right after that it says, when you come to the land, you will take from your first cutting of barley, and you bring that as an offering. It's called a wave offering, and it says, when do you do it? This is mentioned right after the first day of Passover is mentioned, the day after Shabbos, Macharas HaShabbos, the day after Shabbos. Now, we know, based on the oral tradition, that that doesn't mean that you start to bring that offering on a Sunday. And right after that, the Torah says you're supposed to start counting from the day after Shabbos, from the day that you brought this offering, 50 days, 49 days, we count, and the 50th day is another holiday when we bring a wheat offering, which happens to be the holiday, the anniversary of the giving of the Torah. So the Sadducees said, let's take this literally. We start counting the day after Shabbos. Which Shabbos? They made up their own mind which Shabbos they decided to count from. It could have been the Shabbos closest to Passover. But the sages had an oral tradition, and they later on were able to prove it from biblical text, that here the word Shabbos means holiday. The first day of Passover is also called Shabbos, because Shabbos means a day of rest. And a holiday is also a day of rest. So therefore, holidays can also be called Shabbos. Now, what was the conceptual or ideological basis for the dispute here? One interpretation is that the Sadducees recognized that it's a Shabbos. In fact, they observe Shabbos in some ways more strictly than the rest of the Jewish people, because they didn't even believe in having any light any fire burning on Shabbos, so they sat, slept, and ate in the dark. They didn't have any hot food because you can't have a fire burning. So they were in the dark with cold food, and if it was cold, they were in the cold. Because the Torah says don't burn a fire on Shabbos. But the oral tradition said that doesn't mean you can't have a fire burning. We're not supposed to light the fire. And one of the reasons, although it's considered a minor reason, not the major reason, for lighting Shabbos candles is to repudiate the view of the Sadducees, who were considered to be heretics because they rejected the oral tradition. And we light our Shabbos candles right before Shabbos, and they continue burning into Shabbos, and they're supposed to continue burning into Shabbos. So the Sadducees, they observe Shabbos, and they observe the holidays because they're written specifically in the Torah. And they said you can't compare a Shabbos to a holiday. Why? Because you, the rabbis, concede that Shabbos was created by God in the 7 days of creation. 6 days God worked, the seventh day he rested and declared it holy. God made Shabbos holy. How do you determine a holiday? That's determined by the sighting of the moon. 2 witnesses would come to Jerusalem, to the courts. They testified, there were more than 2, but if you needed just 2, that they saw the beginning of a new moon. And the rabbis, who were also astronomers, would cross-examine them to make sure that what they saw was really the moon, and they saw it in the right place in the sky, and so on and so forth. And then, based on the testimony, the rabbis would declare that day Rosh Chodesh. If they were not satisfied with the witnesses' testimony, or the witnesses didn't come, the next day would be Rosh Chodesh, the first of the month, and that's how they would calculate the days of the month. So who creates the holidays? We do. The Jewish courts do. And the Talmud says, and this is Jewish practice, even if the courts erred and they declared the wrong day to be the first day of the month, it was still considered to be the holiday. So they said, how could you equate Shabbos and holidays? How could you say when the Torah says Shabbos, it means a holiday, when holidays are secular relative to Shabbos, because they're made by us, and we're not holy. God is holy, he made Shabbos holy. That was the crux of their disagreement, because they could not believe that God gave the Jewish people this power, this ability to bring holiness into the physical world. God endowed us with holiness, and through that holiness, we can make the holiday holy. In fact, when we recite the blessing in the Amidah and in the Kiddush, when we recite the blessing on any Shabbos, we say, Baruch Atah Hashem, blessed are you God, Mekadesh HaShabbos, who sanctifies the Sabbath. God sanctifies the Sabbath. When you come to a holiday, you do it differently. You don't say Mekadesh HaZmanim, God who sanctified the festivals, but you say Mekadesh Yisrael HaZmanim. God sanctified Israel, the Jewish people, and through them, the holidays were sanctified. So who sanctified the holidays? The answer is God did, but through us, by sanctifying us. And that is something that they could not tolerate. The holiness of the Jewish people that is equal in many ways to the holiness of God himself, because God gave us and endowed us with that holiness. So we go through all the different holidays. As I said before, we have Shabbos, we have Pesach, we have Shavuos, we have Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, we have Sukkot and Shmini Atzeres. So that takes care of all the biblical holidays. Right after the story, the Torah telling us about these holidays, the Torah starts talking about lighting the menorah in the temple, which has already been discussed in an earlier section of the Torah, the book of Exodus, and will be discussed later in the book of Numbers. Why is it mentioned over here? Well, one answer to that is this is a hint to the holiday of Hanukkah, which occurred after the Torah was already canonized, and Hanukkah did not occur in the time of the writing of the Torah. Nevertheless, it's hinted in the Torah. Where is Purim hinted? So this is mentioned by one of the early authorities who lived about 800 years ago, known as the Rokeach, and he says that right after it talks about the menorah, it talks about taking flour and baking 12 chalos. And this was placed on the table in the Mishkan, in the temple, in the tabernacle, later on in the base of Migdash, and this was done every Shabbos. So he says this is a hint to Purim. It's a little bit far-fetched, But this was said by a very great authority, so it behooves us to delve more deeply into it. But he says that's what Purim is about. Purim is a day of feasting. And therefore, when it talks about baking these chalos, these breads, it's a reference, an allusion to Purim. One may add that there's another hint to Purim in the very beginning of the parsha, where it uses the double expression of Emor v'amarta, speak and you shall say, or say and you shall speak. And the question was asked, why is the Torah repeating itself? And one answer was, this is to speak to the elders that they admonish the younger ones. The Midrash says that this is a reference to the story of Purim, in which Achashverosh, the king, when he spoke to his wife, before he knew who she was, spoke to her through an interpreter. Later on, when she divulged her identity, he spoke to her directly. So here you have this double expression to describe the two different forms in which the king spoke to Queen Esther, which is a metaphor as well for God, who is sometimes represented by the word king in the biblical text of the Megillah, the scroll of Esther, and Esther is the Jewish people. And sometimes God talks to us directly. That's when we had the Beis Hamikdash, when we had prophets. Sometimes he talks to us indirectly. We hear God's voice to us, but it's through a cloud. It's not clearly revealed because we are in Golus, we are in exile. When Mashiach takes us out of exile, we'll go back to hearing one voice, not having to go through any type of interpretation, which in a certain sense dulls the sheen, the light of the interpretation. And maybe that ties in with what I said before, to admonish or to bring light from the elders to the younger, that we have to rectify this repetition by bringing in light. At the very end of the parsha, we're going to skip a little bit of the parsha. When we get to the end, there's a very sad story about a Jew who cursed God, and he had to be executed. And that's how the Torah ends, with his execution. The Torah describes what they did, and it says, the children of Israel did as God had commanded Moses, which is repetitious. It says that they executed him, so it's obvious that they did what they were told to do. So there are two interpretations, at least two, about this. One interpretation is that sometimes the Torah tells us we have to administer punishment to someone. They deserve the punishment. And if you don't give them the punishment, you're not helping them. They need it. This is part of the educational process. You have to be very careful how you punish, whom you punish, when you punish, where you punish, and so on. But when punishment is warranted, when discipline is warranted, a person shouldn't feel that it's better if I don't do it. Sometimes you are harming the person by not disciplining them. However, you never enjoy doing the discipline. When you treat your students or anyone else in the community in your position of leadership with love, with kindness, with goodness, relish it. Don't just say, I'm doing it because God told me to do it. Sure, God told you to be nice, but you should feel excited about being able to show your love to someone else. Because even if you don't succeed in changing the person, the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, chapter 32, which is Lev, the heart of Tanya, that if you try to reach a person and help a person through love, even if you're not successful, you still did a mitzvah. It's an intrinsically positive thing. However, if you try to change a person through harshness, it may be warranted, it may be required, it may be mandated, but it's not a mitzvah that you are supposed to relish. You do it because God said so, and you do it only because of that. That's one interpretation. That yes, they carried out this punishment, but they did it because God said so. And another interpretation is this person who cursed God, the Midrash tells us, was doing so because he was blaspheming God, laughing at the commandment to bring loaves of bread, loaves into the temple and keep them on the table for a whole week. And it was supposed to be warm. He was a cynic. He laughed. He mocked it to the point where he started to curse God. Well, whenever a person does something cynical, it always, I shouldn't say always, but it frequently has an effect on other people. All you have to do is express a certain type of cynicism about something, and everyone says, yeah, this is no big deal. Don't take it to heart. Don't feel that this is important or that this is so bad. Cynics have the power that some very powerful people and leaders don't have, and influence people to do good. Cynics instill doubts and compromise the excitement and positive energy that is needed in the way we live as Jews. So you would think that these people were also influenced by the one who cursed God, because he was a cynic. So the Torah says no. They took care of him, and they still did everything God commanded them. I mean, not referring to the execution, but referring to all the observances that he mocked. It didn't affect them. They remained impervious to that influence, and they remained faithful to God's teachings. Have a good night, a good Shabbos, and a very happy Lag BaOmer, because even though Lag BaOmer is technically over at night, we know in matters of holiness the day extends into the night that follows it. So everyone should have a happy Lag BaOmer, and may we celebrate next Lag BaOmer with Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai himself. Mashiach will be here, and we will see the revival, the resurrection of the dead, including Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Have a good Shabbos.